Hello, everybody. I'm Stefan Dercon. I'm the director of the Center for the Study of African Economies. This week, we should have had our conference. The coronavirus thought differently. However, we've been able to convince some of our participants, including some of our panelists and keynote speakers, to offer us a little bit of their time and to make brief recordings of panels and keynotes. So it's in that spirit, I'm very happy to be able to have a few of our panelists available who will discuss quite an interesting issue. Of course, microeconomic research has started to use a lot of RCTs in recent times, not just to answer specific research questions, but also with the ambition to guide policymakers of how to spend their research. Indeed, some of these people involved would argue that maybe the only thing we should spend our resources on is on those things that have rigorous evidence from RCTs. At the same time, we do know that looking over the longer term, the biggest correlate of human progress, of development and human development and poverty reduction tends to be actually economic growth, economic development in general. So that presents a really difficult choice for those who want to spend their resources really well. And it's in that spirit, we've invited two people who in their professional capacity are confronted by these kind of choices and also as a result have to think about it and articulate how to deal with this. So the first speaker is going to be John Halstead. And he studied political philosophy at Oxford for his DPhil. He's now head of applied research at Founders Pledge. Okay, Founders Pledge, that's a community of entrepreneurs with a very specific feature. On joining, every entrepreneur that becomes a member pledges to donate a particular proportion of their personal proceeds on liquidity to charity. Now, as an organization, they're committed to finding and funding solutions to the world's most pressing problems. And they want to be led strongly by evidence and other approaches that actually lead to very high impact. Now, before I let him talk, let me introduce the second speaker as well. Rudge is a senior economist at DFID, working at the Chief Economist Office. Welcome, Anna. Anna studied economics for development at Oxford and held various positions in the UK civil service. Now, she works at DFID, and I know from experience, it's an organization that all the time tries to ask the question, how can we spend our resources most effectively? And indeed, in the last decade or so, the use of evidence has become quite central in making decisions around spending. And so in that sense, she's very well placed to comment on this kind of challenge to spend resources really well, the use of RCTs that gives us more precise evidence on what may work, and at the same time, our broad understanding of how economic growth and economic development are big drivers of progress also in human development and in poverty reduction. But I should let them speak. And therefore, John, why don't you put forward your argument first? Thank you.
Sure, thanks very much. Well, I've prepared some slides in preparation for this, which I'll now try and share. Yeah, so I suppose, as Stefan alluded to, my background is in the effective altruism community, which is probably best known for pushing the use of RCT-backed interventions in global development. And so that's getting people to donate to things like malaria bed net distributions, mass deworming, and that kind of thing. And then a few years ago, I started engaging with the wider literature in economics, and especially the work of Lant Pritchett, who's now at the Blavatnik School, and he was making the case for focusing on economic growth. And I think that was quite compelling from a welfarist perspective, and I think illustrated some of the limitations of just using RCTs as your form of evidence. And I think the trend overall in overseas development assistance and in philanthropy has been more towards the kinds of things that can be tested by RCTs. So you can see here DFID spends a significant fraction of its money on health interventions and on humanitarian aid, and then also spends a lot on economic infrastructure and services, which might be classed as things that improve growth. But a lot of attention, a lot of money goes towards things that could be tested by RCTs. And there's kind of a similar picture in philanthropy, especially driven by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, which devotes a lot of its money, a lot of its attention towards direct programmatic attempts to solve a particular problem. So it'll be trying to eradicate polio in a particular population, or trying to eradicate malaria and that kind of thing. But there's a smaller fraction of effort goes towards policy advocacy and systems reform, which is about a quarter of US philanthropic giving between 2011 and 2015. So I'm going to make 3 arguments for the case for focusing on economic growth. The first is that this claim that differences in income per head explain a substantial fraction of the variance in human welfare today. You can see here this graph which shows the income per head across a range of countries. There's lots of countries with less than $5,000 per head, and the advanced economies have more than $30,000 per head. And we have reasons to think, like quite straightforwardly, that differences in income per head cause large differences in welfare, and this is because people with more income consume more goods with a substantial private good element. That's going to include crucial things like food, transport, shelter, electricity, education, healthcare, and that kind of thing. So that's the causal story from income per head to welfare. And then, as you might expect, increasing income per head is quite strongly correlated with a lot of indicators of human welfare. So it's correlated with life expectancy, it's correlated with nutrition. It's a log scale on the x-axis, so it makes the relationship look less stark. Literacy and poverty. Median income in a country predicts low bar poverty rates almost exactly. So if a country has median income above around $3,500, then it's almost guaranteed to have fewer than 10% of the population on less than $5 per day poverty. So it's very, very strongly correlated with poverty reduction. And life satisfaction, you can see here the large gains you get to life satisfaction, especially in poor countries, as well as the limited gains. Rich countries, as people get tired of their toys and trinkets. And then sort of drawing all this together, income per head is strongly correlated with more holistic measures of welfare, like the Human Development Index. This is another one developed by Jones and Klenov, which is a composite welfare metric, which accounts for inequality, accounts for consumption, leisure time, and health. And you can see that the correlation between income per head and welfare on this metric is still quite strong, even though there are quite large differences at a given level of income per head. So for example, if you look at the difference between Angola and Egypt, which have maybe like a tenth of US GDP per head, but Angola is 1/64th, has 1/64th as much welfare as the US, whereas Egypt has 1/16th. So there's big differences, but nevertheless, there is a strong correlation between income per head and welfare per head on this metric. So given that growth seems to play such a big role in explaining human welfare, differences in human welfare, it makes sense to, if you're looking for the best way to improve human welfare, the first place to start seems to be to ask the question, how do we most cost effectively increase growth? Which, asking that question, the kinds of things that are evaluated by evidence-based development or by the randomistas or people focusing on RCTs don't tend to be top candidates for things that could increase growth. So mobile phone reminders for vaccinations, cash transfers, malaria nets, they don't seem to play a big role in the causal story of why some countries are have much greater income per head than others. There's many possible determinants of differences in income per head, and that'll be things like geography, culture, institutions and things like that, and then obviously policy. And the policy question is, of course, highly controversial, as everyone in the field knows, but it's going to include things like education, trade liberalization, opening up economies, infrastructure spending, things like that. And most of the things in this realm can't be tested by RCTs. So just by limiting ourselves to RCTs, we foreclose this whole range of tools which we could use to increase income per head in very poor countries. The second argument is that the 1950s, since the 1950s, there's been this era that Pritchett calls the development era, which is the end of colonization, Bretton Woods, Truman's 4-point plan, and just a concerted effort by economists and states to increase development. And that went extremely well. If you look at this chart, this is if countries can either travel north or south from the diagonal line, and north means positive growth and south means negative growth relative to 1950. And you can see that there's just been a massive increase in growth since 1950, and indeed on all objective measures than all prior human history combined in the last 60 or so years. So this raises the question, why would we start then focusing on a fourth development that is completely different? Why would we have a strategic shift? And then it's related to that, it's kind of interesting to look at some of the best buys in RCT-backed development in this context. So the charity evaluator GiveWell says that deworming, mass school deworming, is the most cost-effective way to improve economic outcomes for the poor. But then if you look at this sort of picture of economic performance since 1950, it seems very unlikely, this seems very unlikely to be true, because deworming just seems to explain a minuscule fraction of the variation in individual economic outcomes across individuals. It seems much more a matter of policy and other factors. The third argument is appeals to a cost-effectiveness analysis. So we can compare what the best that RCT-backed development interventions can do. So there's this program called the graduation approach, which provides business training and productive assets to people in low-income countries. And there's been 6 RCTs across different contexts, which suggests that it fairly robustly produces good outcomes. And in terms of net present value, it produces about a 1.6x return on average. And if we can compare that to what growth can do, so if you imagine you spent $1 billion on the graduation approach in Ethiopia, given that there's 100 million people in Ethiopia, that would increase per person income by about $16 per person in net present value. And this is, as this chart illustrates, very small compared to the per person effective growth episodes. If you look at the Vietnamese growth episodes since 1989, that's a gain of nearly $7,000 per head, and then you get even larger gains and then even larger reductions for places that have had very bad economic outcomes. The Vietnamese case is interesting because if you wanted to increase income per head by nearly $7,000 using the graduation approach, you'd have to spend more than $300 billion, which is more than the current GDP of Vietnam. It seems like a better lever is to try and increase the national development level of Vietnam rather than doing a sort of programmatic RCT-backed intervention. That's the scale of the benefits that you could get, but that doesn't tell us how good investing in growth or national development is in expected value terms, because we don't know the probability of effect, or whether we know enough to move growth in the right direction, which is still a bit of an open question in the literature. But there's some ways to get a grip on this intuition. One is that if you think about, make the kind of de minimis argument, which is, you know, how good would economists have to be to beat the best that RCT-backed development can do? So you can roughly estimate that all economists professionally from 1960 to 2010 cost about $300 billion in terms of wages and health insurance and all that kind of stuff. And then suppose instead of having economists, we spent that money on the graduation approach, we get about $480 billion in net present value. So then if you think about what effect did economists have on the change in Chinese economic policy in the 1970s. And that produced about that change in the sort of trend line produced about $14 trillion in cumulative economic benefits. So if the only thing the profession did over that time was to increase the chance of that policy change by about 4%, the probability of that policy change, that would have had greater expected economic benefits than what the graduation could have done. And it seems like for those familiar with what happened in the Chinese case, that the economics profession did actually have quite a large effect on the path that China took. And in addition to this, economists have also affected numerous other $100 billion growth episodes in Indonesia, Vietnam, and so on, which suggests that that's going to be a more cost-effective approach than evidence-based development in the long term. So yeah, that's the thumbnail sketch of my argument.
Thank you, John, for this concise introduction. Anna, maybe turning to you. You know, you've just heard his presentation. At the same time, I know at DFID, you know, the organization and all the advisors in DFID, they're very strongly committed to work as evidence-based as possible. And they are saying most of the time it's also allowed to pursue things based on evidence. It's also committed to growth with inclusivity, but it also then means that it's, you know, is committed to work really at on growth issues, on scale issues, and so on. So I would be quite interested to hear from you, how is DFID approaching around issues to do with growth and economic development, this whole question of how to spend in an evidence-based way?
Well, John, thanks so much for setting out your presentation, and Stefan, thanks for that intro. I want to talk a bit about how it approaches trying to spend on economic development in an evidence-based way, as you say. To me, I think there are three parts to that. I think if it's strategy, through our research, and also structurally how we'll set ourselves up. So firstly, on the strategy piece, DFID a couple of years ago, I think it's 2017, set out an economic development strategy where it said that life-changing progress comes from growth that transforms economies, that creates productive and private sector investment, that benefits and that spreads benefits and opportunities right across societies, and that this is essential to eradicating extreme poverty, delivering the global goals, and ending reliance on aid. So I think, although that's a couple of years out of date now, I think that piece around the importance of economic growth and inclusivity is extremely important to DFID. It was showcased just a couple of months ago during the Africa Investment Summit that the UK hosted. So strategically, it's always been a big part, especially in the last, I don't know, 5 or 6 years. It's been a big part of our work. I'm based in the research and evidence department. I think a big part of how we're trying to encourage spending on economic development to be in the most evidence-based way is through the research that we invest in. So it's worth just taking stock of the fact that there's been major growth research investments over the last 15 years or so. The Spence Commission on Growth and Development 2008 talked about that we know what the ingredients are to drive growth in a country, but we don't know the recipe, which I thought was really interesting. And since then, there's been loads of investment in pinning down specifically what will work or what could work where through various different programs that we've funded and others have funded. I'm told by my colleagues that DFID is the largest bilateral funder of growth research, which I'm very proud to hear. And this investment over the last 15 years that DFID and other organisations have been putting in have taught us a little bit more about maybe what that recipe for achieving economic growth in a specific country might be. Some of the research is RCT, but not all. Much is also other types of rigorous experimental methods. And we also do broader theoretical things and use some case study methods to get higher level questions. I think John's right that in lots of cases, RCTs can't answer the specific big questions that we want to look at, but they can help us to add up our understanding in lots of individual areas. So the IGC, the International Growth Centre that DFID funds, have a whole series of papers coming out soon on what they've learned over the last 10 years of research. Actually, I think some of it's out now, which is quite exciting. So that's some of the research that we build on and try and learn from, encourage other spending money on spending aid to learn from. And then it's worth just reflecting structurally on how we're set up to try and encourage a focus on economic development that is inclusive and how that can be evidence-based. I think it's really worth thinking through how do policymakers or donors actually work so that evidence can help them make good decisions. So in DFID, our first layer is that we've got a series of teams that provide intellectual guidance. That's from our team at the Chief Economist's Office, the rest of Research and Evidence Division, and then we've got specific policy teams like the Growth and Resilience Department who provide advice on the latest evidence to the rest of the department. And we aim to help others understand the evidence base better and to have the tools they need to examine their own local conditions and work out how to apply this evidence to their particular scenario. So a second layer of our structural design for how we get across evidence on economic development is trying to apply this through country-specific lenses. So we've got country economists in almost everywhere that we work who will think about what almost diagnose what are the main issues going on in the country and what is really needed in the country in order to promote growth and inclusive growth within that. And then a third layer is at the intervention stage. So for every new program that DFID wants to spend, we come up with a very rigorous business case, and that this examines the evidence base for the problem and also the evidence base for how you approach it, what the response would be and how to implement it. And then our fourth layer, once all of those data have been gone through, the strategy, the advice, the country context, the business case for the intervention, the fourth layer is around, we've got a quality assurance unit who really rigorously assess all large business cases and forensically examine that good evidence has been used, especially with economic development business cases. And we'll encourage the team different sources of evidence and challenge on the approaches that are being taken. Those are the broad ways that we sort of, as a strategy and using research and structurally, are set up so that we can encourage the policymakers within DFID and then also the counterparts that we work with in other organisations to keep using the best possible evidence that they can in heading towards inclusive growth. I think there's something really exciting about using different sorts of evidence, and RCTs to me seem like a big part of that, but not everything. They don't answer every question, as John said. So that's the approach that we're taking. Thanks, Stefan.
Well, thank you, Anna. So maybe turning to John, I just want to dig a little bit deeper into this. So, when you're talking about building up an evidence base that can tell us about what needs to be done to promote economic development and growth, while you were also alluding to the kind of relative comfort of this kind of evidence base that like an organization like GiveWell can use on, very specific things like a reminder for by mobile phone for a vaccination or deworming or something very, very specific. So how do you think about what an evidence base could look like that can compete with that relative comfort of the very specific, small and well identified, and at least the things we probably end up thinking about on economic development and growth kind of issues probably involve multiple things at the same time. They will involve some really big scale, So how do you think that will ever be of the kind of, rigor or comparability with a kind of evidence base that effective altruism organizations that want to be very strongly evidence-based can work with?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, obviously getting high quality evidence for that sort of more structural systemic change is much more difficult, and there's lots of problems with confounders and statistical identification and that kind of thing. So I suppose there's two things to say. One is that I think there's limitations also to RCT evidence. So I think maybe people have this impression that the RCT is the gold star, and then everything else is like much, much worse. But lots of recent research has shown there's many drawbacks with RCT-backed interventions, and especially around external validity, where it's unclear how things translate from context to context. And Lamp-Pritchett's argued that using just ordinary least squares regression is a better predictor of performance of a program even than an RCT, provided it's done in the same context. So I think there's limitations to RCT evidence. That's not to say that the evidence around growth is good. I think like maybe the median view about 20 years ago in the literature seemed to be like, we don't know anything about growth. The Washington consensus has failed and we don't know what to do. And maybe all of these growth episodes are just a bit of a coincidence that we can't understand. But I think that view is shifting a bit, and there seems to be there's this field of growth diagnostics starting, which is trying to not use this very prescriptive and inflexible menu of like policy reforms, but looking at what's the sort of bottleneck for this specific country. And I think that's just going to involve using all of the high quality statistical tools that social scientists need, whilst sort of recognizing their limitations.
So, well, thank you, John. So maybe Anna, if I can, I don't want to put you on the spot, but I just wonder, how in DFID you can try to navigate this space of some areas like health with very precise evidence, and you can probably go to your seniors, your ministers even, with some very precise, if we do this, that's the kind of impact we'll have, relative to the more economic things that are, well, by their nature maybe lack that kind of precision of prediction. So do you have a sense that this is a conflict, or is this something that one can quite easily navigate? And so can you give me a sense of how this gets handled within DFID these days?
I think to some people it feels like a conflict. I think to some it feels like there's this very rigorous, specific evidence, and that's telling us to spend on very small things, or small total bit of the total. And then there are others who are saying we need to work with questions. Personally, and I think lots of people probably are in my camp, I don't see it as a conflict. I see them as extremely helpful to look at both sides. So we know that, for example, we think that around 80% of the world's poor in 2030 will be living in very fragile countries. It's difficult to do lots of RCTs in a very fragile conflict or an ongoing war zone. And yet we know we want to spend very fragile countries. It's difficult to do fragile conflict or an ongoing war zone. And yet we know we want to keep, if you're delivering education in a very fragile place, you might well want to learn from some rigorous RCTs of an education program that have taken place somewhere else. Many of the insights that we've learned from another context may well be helpful. It doesn't definitely be comparable. I think it's a shame not to learn from all the evidence insights that we've learned from those. So as we ask questions, let's try and do that more rigorously. And as we ask tight RCT questions, let's try to do them in more context and learn more about where they fall down, where they do work and don't work. So I think it's easy to see it as an ideological divide, but to me, and I think to a lot of people in politics or designing a business case, it doesn't seem so much like a divide. It seems like there's a range of evidence, and as part experts and partly as just individuals trying to do the right thing, we're trying to balance up those different pieces of evidence. So sorry, the went a bit there. So as I see it, there's a lot we can learn from RCT, and there's a lot of the questions which won't be answered by RCTs, but for organisations like other big donor organisations, it's an opportunity to learn from all sorts of evidence. And I read through the business cases and new programs coming in, and it's clear to see that colleagues across the department are using a combination of both types of evidence. So I think it's an opportunity rather than a limitation.
So maybe I'll come to kind of maybe a final question for both of you, which is, even if we buy that, economic growth and economic development is in the end the strongest predictor of progress, of development as a whole. But at the same time, we are thinking here about spending resources of, a government department like DFID, or charitable organizations or individuals that want to spend on development. One of the problems with spending on issues to do with growth and economic development, rather than this kind of more, call it marginalist, these small things that actually are quite good for people, but may not make the big change. If you want to spend on growth and economic development, you're very quickly going to touch upon issues to do with markets, but that also typically becomes about market power, politics, competition, issues to do that are much more politically sensitive in the kind of countries one works with. So John, maybe first, do you see that as enough reason to try to encourage this agenda, also as seen from more of these charitable organizations, to move more into economic development areas? Or isn't it just safer for them to stay in these relatively small, precise things, but that arguably are also less threatening for the local politics and power relationships in these societies?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think probably politicization is one of the main drawbacks of doing that kind of work. Things like giving out malaria nets or doing teaching at the right level, it's not very controversial. Everyone kind of is on board with that. Economic growth is very politicized. I mean, you can see in Chile now that, this is one of the most advanced economies in Latin America, but the people there are very, very unhappy about the current system. Yeah, it's a risk you'd have to manage. It's hard to know what to say in general about it. I think there's probably are cases where it's maybe not as politicized in specific contexts. Maybe there's, for example, you could imagine sort of broad national consensus over the need for reform, but lack of technical knowledge of exactly how to do it. And in that case, maybe funding technical, like a think tank to provide technical assistance or something like that. That's one aspect of it. Another aspect of it is that, in no small part, probably rich world countries do a lot of damage to poor countries. So you could advocate for reform there, like that's what the Centre for Global Development does, for example. You could change policies in rich countries around subsidies, around tariffs, and that would benefit poor countries as well. So yeah, I totally agree. It's something that needs to be borne in mind, and it's a really tricky one for philanthropists. Whether that should exclude it entirely is a bit of an uncertain question, which hopefully we're going to figure out over the next few months.
Excellent. Well, maybe Anna, how do you deal with that in a kind of a context of the Department for International Development? You know, how do you deal with that? Because, you know, growth and maybe many of the things you do in countries all touch on politics quite quickly.
So I think I've been thinking about a lot in DFID, and I feel like economists have been thinking about it more over the last decades as well. So, across DFID, we recently published a paper called Governance for Stability, Inclusion and Economic Growth, which really helpfully set out how we think that it's really important to think about the political economy in order to achieve any of these outcomes that we might want to achieve, which we grouped into inclusion, stability, and growth. But thinking through a political lens and a governance lens, I think more and more recognizing is really important. But that's a helpful overall strategy, but there's no one size fits all, obviously. So we in DFID have been using diagnostic tools to understand as best we can the interaction between politics, state, society, economy, human capital, external forces, to sort of understand the country as a system, to think about the overarching trends and bottlenecks, not as distinct pieces with distinct pieces of analysis, but actually as something that all come together, want to think about together. So it's not creating new evidence in the sense of a rigorous RCT, but rather analysis of development dynamics and as part of that, identification of entry points. So what might be a tractable thing that could be worked on? So where are areas that could be really important for economic growth, but there are actually possible work on because the politics allows it. So which sectors or this, but it's not all development impact on the country as a system, then you might want to use RCT or cross-country evidence to identify specific interventions within that area that are likely to have the highest level of impact. So there's almost two different levels of analysis, and I think with both of them, so understanding the overall where you might work in a country and then the specific interventions, I think with both of them it's really important to be, I think a term my governance colleagues have been using more is thinking and working politically. So understanding the political elements of what might work or what might not work. I think at the macro level, with some of the big growth interventions you might want to make, I think a real advantage for donors and bilateral donors like DFID is that we can have relationships with politics. We can do politics, and working with the Foreign Office, for example, helps with that as well. It's somewhere that we need our ministers and country heads to actively engage with the politics rather than just stepping away and saying this is too difficult and too political. Obviously not in every instance, it's not always our place to act, but sometimes it can be that a donor can intervene in some way. So I think most of the substantial policy change that we might want to see that would lead to economic development and growth is going to involve some sort of policy or politics, and we have to be upfront about that and recognize it, and sometimes tackle it head on, and sometimes step back and realize it's not for us now. Thanks.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I think I think I want to bring this to a close now. I want to thank John Halstead and Anna Rudge profusely for, in these more difficult circumstances, to to actually give a bit of their time and to give their thoughts of what should have been a live panel discussion at our conference. But for now, I would thank you both very much, and stay safe.
Thanks, Stefan.
Thanks very much, Stefan and John.